This event is in partnership with Médecins Sans Frontières, otherwise known as Doctors Without Borders here in the United States. Allow me to take a moment to thank our partners at MSF, in particular Fabien Dubois, there he is, hiding there. Thank you, Fabien. MSF representative to the United Nations and a partner of ours here in New York. And I'd also like to thank my colleague Alice Daubert, IPI policy analyst, without whom none of this would have come together. This event forms part of IPI's dedicated program on humanitarian affairs and is of particular relevance to an IPI research project on emergency responses in conflict-infected contexts. This features case studies on Yemen, Syria, and Sudan. In the last couple of years at the United Nations and in the broader humanitarian policy world, there have been a lot of conversations around the protracted nature of contemporary conflicts and the resulting need to make connections among the work of humanitarian and development actors. At the same time, many have expressed concern that the pendulum of priorities has perhaps swung too far in the direction of thinking about the long term. There is a risk of losing focus on the immediate question of whether and how the humanitarian system is effectively responding to the acute phases of conflict or crises. The research conducted by MSF during the past 2 years has shown that the first few months of crises are too often marked by a failure to provide life-saving assistance and protection to those affected by violence, that there is indeed an emergency gap. This event provides an opportunity to explore the concrete ways in which the emergency response capacity of the humanitarian sector can be reinforced to ensure that humanitarian actors can effectively respond to both immediate emergencies and protracted crises. We cannot forget that the long term and the short term had the same starting point, which is now. And this is all the more important to remember in emergencies when lives are on the line. We are fortunate to have with us here a very distinguished and experienced panel of committed humanitarians to discuss all of this, to reflect on ways in which to reduce the emergency gap. Teresa San Cristobal is the Director of Operations of MSF Spain. Teresa has a long-standing career with MSF, both in the field as head of mission in countries such as the DRC, the Central African Republic, South Sudan, and Yemen, as well as at headquarters. John Ging is Director of the Operation Division at UN OCHA and the lead advisor to the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs on operational decision-making. Prior to this, John was the Director of the UN Relief and Works Agency operations in the Gaza Strip. And Bob Kitchen is the International Rescue Committee's Vice President of Emergencies. Bob has led IRC's emergency response in Chad, Nepal, Indonesia, and the Central African Republic. The full biographies of our panelists are in your programs. We, as you see, have a lot of great experience, a lot of practical experience here at the table. So I expect some good insights to come from this. No pressure. But it is with great pleasure then that I first give the floor to Teresa San Cristobal. And Teresa will tell us a little bit about MSF's Emergency Gap Project and the conclusions and all of the above. Teresa, the floor is yours.
It is for us very, very important to have the opportunity to be in such a forum, and of course to John and to Bob for being here with us tonight. Well, tonight, sorry, for me it's tonight, for you this morning. So the Breathing the Emergency Gap Project was conceived some years ago, 2 years ago, when we have the feeling from the field that more and more we were not capable to respond on time to the needs of the population, and then the most of the emergencies we were starting to do more things than before, different things than before, because we didn't see as many actors as before in the field. So we decided to do two things. First, to analyze 5 contexts and to see if it was more a perception or a real fact that we see an emergency gap, and if it was a difference. And the second thing, we decided to discuss with the system, with the ecosystem. So we have interview and have forums of discussion with 60 NGOs, with the majority of the big donors, and with a big number of UN bodies. And we reached to the conclusion that the emergency gap was a fact, and that it was a feeling among all of us that it was increasing a fact. So in this sense, we are a little bit more optimistic than 2 years ago, because we have seen that the majority of the people we have been talking to perceive the gap and wants to make something. So the objective of the study is to be provocative, and of course, as MSFers, we are going to see our point of view, but what we want is to promote a dialogue that allows that other point of view, other things can come, but at the end, the result will be to decrease the gap. So we basically think that we are in an ecosystem, in a system where the value of humanitarian assistance has decreased, where it is not so easy to talk about the needs of the populations, and we are more on the needs of the system, on the long-term vision, with a lot of time dedicated to that, with very limited time dedicated to discuss on what we do in the very acute phase. So basically, what we see is that some of the moves that they are happening in the policy arena are quite dangerous for the humanitarian space, and even if we have to coexist and we have to work together, we think that some of the possible obstacles for the humanitarian space are not taken in account, and we are not taking the measures, the right measures, to make sure that both we can coexist and that it will be possible to have a better response for the populations. So basically we are especially more worried about the conflicts, and in an environment of anti-terror world, and we are especially concerned about our capacity and the different values that the humanitarian action have, of independence, of agility, of timeliness, coverage. They are less and less in the table, and we really consider that there are ways to change this, and that not one fit all is possible, and that if we don't accept the added value of each one and the very specific way of working of each one, is going to be extremely complicated. So humanitarian assistance is really focused on people. And when you are focused on people, you need to be independent and impartial, and you have to be with the mindset of the needs of the people. Will sometimes create conflict with the state, sometimes create conflicts with a long-term interest, and sometimes it will be not very well appreciated for those that they have a long-term vision. So we have divided the report in 3 groups, like what we request to the donors, what we request to the UN system, and what we request to the NGOs, and of course MSF included. It's not that we consider that we are very good. I mean, we also consider that we have to improve quite a lot. So what we expect that this provoke is how we discuss policy that make possible to coexist the humanitarian and the long-term objectives. So for the donors, we consider that there is less and less in the request of a donor the word timeliness. So if the work is done, it's okay. But as a medical organization, if you arrive after the first golden hour, your work will have a totally different impact on the person. No? So what we are saying is we need to be when the critical needs are, and not 3 months later. So we ask to the donors to understand this. And we ask to the donor also to support the frontline organizations. We consider that a frontline organization who wants to respond to emergency has to be prepared for that, and it means that they have to invest beforehand. It means that something that donors don't like too much, that they call structural costs, it is unavoidable if you want to have an emergency response. If you want to have an emergency response, you will have to have a pool of people that has the knowledge and that is capable to deploy in any moment. You will have to have some stocks. You will have to have some preparedness that if you don't have it, it will take you 2 to 3 months to prepare it, and we know that this will be too late for many people. So we ask to the donors being capable to think about these topics when they make their decision on how to deliver funding. And of course, we ask to the donors that they understand that in emergencies, the way of working is different, the accountability mechanism is different. It's extremely difficult to have the same system, the same set of tools for an organization that is running in an emergency, and it will not, I mean, it will make impossible for some organizations to fulfill with the commitments if they are equal to a project that can have a 5 years length. And to the UN, we are asking that they don't forget the humanitarian action as one of the core discussions that they have to have. I mean, we understand perfectly the development discussions. What we miss is the space for humanitarian discussions. What we miss is that they always have to balance the need of fast response and long-term vision. And we ask also to humanitarian coordinators in the field to prepare a frame that will allow the people to work. And I don't know, I mean, help everybody, not only the normal partners, to be fast deployed in the field. And for the NGOs, what we consider is that first we have all to push for this humanitarian discussion to be there. And second, that we have to change our mindset. I mean, being capable or not to respond to emergencies is a decision. If today we don't decide that we want to keep the humanitarian space, that we want to make sure that we will be able to be fast in the next big crisis, it will be impossible, because you have to prepare yourself. You have to take decisions that sometimes are hard, of where you invest your money, where you invest your learning, where you invest your preparedness, where you invest everything. So what we think is that that some NGOs, we have discussed with many, some NGOs in a given moment see so difficult to respond in acute emergency that they have given up. And we are calling to everybody to come back, I mean, to everybody who is interested, to come back to the mindset that will allow to do it. And as a conclusion, we are also for MSF trying to, we will have in June a full day dedicated to see what are the things that we have done in the past are making us a little bit slower, or what are the complications that we have and how we will be able to overcome them in the future. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for explaining to us a bit about the MSF's Emergency Gap Project and your conclusions. And in particular, it's striking to me that the recognition that there really is a broad consensus around the diagnosis of this problem, that there is indeed a gap. When we were organizing this event, I was sort of steeling myself for a big debate, but actually there is really a lot of consensus around the problem, and a lot of the question is how to address it. So thank you for also sort of previewing a bit the recommendations in the report. I will now turn the floor over to John. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to participate. I'd like to start off by appreciating the MSF report. I think it's very timely, and I think it's absolutely essential. My overall message here this afternoon is that as a world we are losing our humanity, full stop. And then we all have to ask ourselves, what can we do differently to do better in terms of projecting humanity? It's in our self-interest to do so. I think we've forgotten that as well. We're not talking about charity, we're not talking about generosity, we're talking about enlightened self-interest. When we have a situation on this rich planet of having so many tens of millions in peril of being killed, suffering needlessly, then we have to all answer to ourselves and for ourselves and to them, what is it that we can do better to change their plight? And if it's a matter of global resources, then there's no problem. It's a very small resource demand on a very rich world to address the humanitarian needs of the people who are otherwise going to die today or suffer needlessly. But I do think that we have to then parse it out and look at the different audiences, constituencies that can be helpful. We had a good moment, a good year in 2015 when at the political level globally there were a number of initiatives that were taken and that set out commitments aligned with responsibility and shared understanding of how to get to a better world. We had the World Humanitarian Summit, we had an agenda for humanity set out clearly there. We had the Sustainable Development Goals that adopted a very, noble program that was going to leave nobody behind by 2030. We had the adoption of the agreement on climate change. So we can say that at the highest political level, not just because of those particular elements, but indicative that there is a clear understanding and there is a clear outline of what we should be doing. I would say since 2015 we've been falling short across the board, and that is also reflected then in this MSF report, which clearly says that there is a gap in the front line and on the front line of international humanitarian action. That means that so many people are needlessly dying or being killed, because unfortunately 80% of humanitarian action is now conducted in conflict settings. So this is another element of our collective failure, that these conflicts have been allowed to prevail over political forums where the issues, whatever they might be, should be more properly resolved. So at the political level, it's, as I say, it's clearly understood, but it's not happening. So we're not seeing first and foremost the resourcing of humanitarian action. It's running at an average of about 50% between what is required and what is provided. I do acknowledge, and with appreciation, that many member states continue to increase their contributions to humanitarian action. But the problem is that not all member states are stepping up to their declared responsibility. When I say a declared responsibility, there have been declarations of what that means. 0.7% of GNI. Again, all finance ministers went to Addis Ababa in 2015 and made that declaration. But they're not living up to that commitment in terms of what they will provide for development assistance, of which humanitarian is a component. And if they were to live up to that, then we would be fully funded. Secondly, the space, which is often referred to in the MSF report, the political commitment that we need to do the work that needs to be done in the places where it needs to be done. So gaining access, being able to have protection for the innocent civilians, to have protection for aid workers to conduct their activities. We need political support to be able to do what we are responsible to do on the front line of humanitarian action. And what we're seeing is that we have less and less space in which to operate. It's more and more insecure, more and more aid workers are being killed, and there is more and more obstruction to the conduct of humanitarian action on the front line. And again, this has to be addressed back to global political leadership. The politically powerful, the militarily powerful, the financially powerful. Because all of these issues can be resolved if there is political will. So these would be two elements that I would address at the global political level. The issue of political commitment to humanitarian action and to ensuring that humanitarian action can be conducted and delivered as we are responsible and have made commitment to do to the people who for their lives depend on us successfully doing that and overcoming all those obstacles, operational obstacles between us and them. And on the funding side, stop the hand-wringing about it being expensive. It's not. Relatively speaking, it's a small fraction. And it's an even smaller fraction of what is being spent on other international instruments. And we need to be very clear that we have set out in our global architecture for international response, we have set out humanitarian as a pillar of international response. We have many other pillars, and as MSF have said, we need to make sure we have cohesion, we have coherence, we have complementarity, we have maximum effectiveness for the benefit of the people who depend on us. But that does not mean that we have a loss of distinction and identity and focus for humanitarian action. And there are far too many people in the world today that are dying because we don't have that clarity of focus on humanitarian action. Finally, of course, we have to address ourselves in the humanitarian community, and I'm really pleased that MSF have highlighted what we, as the organisations within international humanitarian action, have to also do better to make sure that we get onto the front line more effectively and more efficiently. And I think and welcome the demands that are placed on us to be more effective. We have a big struggle, of course, and that is beyond our control. But we also have to be accountable to the people who depend on us, that we are in fact doing all that we can possibly do, and that we're putting the resourcing where we should be putting it to their best effect. And that means being more innovative, that means being more flexible, that means being more adaptive, that means being less bureaucratic, and so forth. And again, I think that we should have more of these conversations in the locations where we're actually dependent on doing effective work. So in other words, we should be not having as many discussions detached from the places where we're working. We should be having them in the places where people are dying and suffering needlessly, and in a way that is accountable to them, if it's making sense to them that we're doing all that we can possibly do to help them efficiently and effectively, and equally look back at our international endeavour through their eyes, not through our eyes, through their eyes, and answer the question then that they would reasonably and legitimately pose to us: is this the best that you can do? And frankly speaking, as long as so many people are dying needlessly and unnecessarily, the answer to that question has to be no, we have to do better. Thank you.
Great, thanks, John. Clear and provocative as always. I think the key point for me is that people really are suffering needlessly. I think a lot of people look at the context today and feel a sense of hopelessness. But the reality is that it is in our capacity to respond. Issues related to falling short of resources or resistance, closing space for humanitarian action. These are within our capacity and our political systems to actually respond to. And so that's a hopeful thought and a call to action. So thank you. And I will now turn the floor to Bob. Bob, please.
So I'm happy to be here with you all today. Adam, if you had hoped that you would have an argument up the front, I'm going to let you down again as the third speaker. I'd like to start by just saying how much we welcomed the report as an organisation, as well as the excellent consultations that MSF undertook to bring forward their reflections and recommendations. It really does represent many of the views held by emergency responders around the world, so thank you to MSF. I'm going to offer today several operational reflections that are probably a little more field-focused and granular than you've heard so far today, but they're based on something that my colleague said earlier, that 8 years ago the IRC itself reflected on the fact that we needed to get good at emergency response again, that we had found that our muscles, our emergency response muscles had atrophied, that we found ourselves passing on emergencies more and more often because they were too small or too complex, and that we made the decision that we needed to get good. So we have invested heavily over the last 8 years to get there. So that's kind of the background to which I bring my reflections to you today. I was asked to talk about the external measures needed to enable a conducive environment for response. So that's the first part of my what I'll bring to you today. And the second is about the internal shifts needed within NGOs to empower emergency response. So what needs to happen on the outside and what needs to happen on the inside. On the outside, the first is, John's spoken about it a little bit, but we need to see a change in the donor community's outlook on investing up front. They have to invest in capacity and not just in response. An analogy that I use quite frequently is that firefighters don't get paid on a per fire basis. Neither should aid organizations. We're saving lives every day. Firefighters don't have to raise funds from private donors to maintain readiness to respond, which is the response that we get to donors every single day. Well, can't you find some donors to pay for your staff and your readiness? They often make that hand signal for some reason. MSF is lucky to have private resources, but for the rest of the humanitarian community, something has to give within donors for us to be able to be ready to get into the deep field and deliver responses. I'd recommend for donors' consideration that we go through the famous competitive process that has to be in place to ensure the transparency of donor fund allocations, but do so before crises. Do it in advance to build a network of responders, to invest in standing capacity. Within our industry, there is a program known as the Rapid Response Mechanism that is used in many countries. That is a local version of what we need at the global level, where there is a network of organizations that are ready to go, that are supported financially to respond in emergencies. The second part is the flip side of investing in capacity, which is having proper systems for standby response funding. So we don't have to wait for 3 months to get emergency funding into the field. This is the other half of the rapid response mechanism that works so well, which is investing in capacity up front and then having funds on hand to deploy and save lives. This isn't just a plea to say, give us the money and we'll take care of it. It has to be managed and performance has to be overseen, and high performers need to continue being part of the network and low performers need to be said goodbye to. We want to stand accountable to the people that we're serving and to our donors. Sweden has it nearly right, as does the Netherlands with their various framework agreements and the Disaster Risk Alliance. There's a lot to learn there. DFID, the UK government, has it right on paper, but not in action through its rapid response facility that they haven't used for many, many years, but continues to talk about. The US and everybody else has positive intent, but just they're not there. It takes 3 months to get money out the door, and it's not okay. So we have to invest up front. Moving away from donors and focusing on my friend at the end of the table, we need to focus on the front line more. The UN has to get serious about the risk tolerance within the deployment of transportation. So I'm talking about the UN Humanitarian Air Service. Time and time again, the UN pull out, and then the NGOs just have to figure out whether they can stay alone without an evacuation route, whether we have to charter our own plane. We have to figure it out on our own. Donors don't want to pay for those costs because they've already paid for the UN. Something has to give, whether that's the UN getting serious about understanding that we operate in risky places. You can't bail. You have to be there to help people. Or donors have to start empowering NGO consortia to maintain air fleets again. The older people in the room will probably remember AirServe from back in the day. It was a good model. It helped us a lot. NGOs continue to get bumped off UNHAS, which just blows my mind. We're the frontline staff saving lives. Why are we not on the plane? I was bumped off a flight a couple of weeks ago. It's fun. Access negotiations, second thing. The UN, OCHA, either has to find a better way of bringing the humanitarian community together to do collective access negotiations with non-state armed actors and sometimes state actors, or the NGOs need to band together in small like-minded consortia to do those negotiations ourselves, because we spend so much time in places like South Sudan and CAR in meeting rooms in the capital talking about red line documents and how we're going to approach it, and not actually talking to the belligerents to get access to the field. So again, more focus on the front line and less focus on air-conditioned meeting rooms. Moving to look at internal shifts that are needed. And I want to flag up one thing up front, and this is reflecting on the report, the content of the report that speaks about the focus on collective outcomes and the new way of working coming away from the WHS, and that if we focus on everything, we won't be able to succeed in emergency response. From our perspective as an organisation, the IRC, the jury's still out on that, whether that is the case. I'm learning Americanisms while I'm being here, and a colleague said yesterday that we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. I think that applies here, that we have to be, as an organisation, we believe that if we create the space and the emergency mindset that I completely endorse from the report, and I'll talk about in a minute, that we can respond to emergencies, and then other parts of our organisation can engage on longer term efforts, engage and advocate and advise, as we are doing now, on how World Bank funding can be used to its most impact to serve the needs of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, for example. There is a tension there, and if we divide our focus, there is a risk of not doing either well. But we're big organizations, and I have never subscribed to the adage that multi-mandated organizations can't be good at emergency response. My career depends on that belief, so I hope I'm right. So to speak to the internal shifts that need to take place, it really is around the emergency mindset, and this speaks to my own experience over the last 8 years. The things that we have done and have seen huge change as a result of, I'll let you know about, and some of the things that we're still challenged by. So one of the things that we're doing on an ongoing basis is reinforcing all of our global 12, 13,000 staff around the world, their understanding of humanitarian ethics and humanitarian principles as the foundation for action, that we understand what we do, why we do it, who we are and what we stand for, as a foundation for making decisions and prioritization. A really operational matter is having a clear classification system that tells you what has happened and makes recommendations about what you as an organization needs to do. In years gone by, we have taken the first 48 hours as an organization arguing about whether we should respond or not. With a clear classification system, we have that decision made within an hour now. So we can move, and the organization moves as one. I think organizations, as we have to invest in the emergency preparedness planning cycle, followed with a serious financial investment, investing at the field level. It's not about central emergency response teams. I'm very proud of our central emergency response team, but with the world the way it is at the moment, it's not enough. We have to have all of our staff in the game. So building capacity, empowering risk analysis and response planning, establishing clear metrics for success and managing performance against those metrics within preparedness. And then the same thing for response. As an organization and as wider community, setting goals. We will hold ourselves accountable to these sectors. We will be present. We will deliver this percentage to this percentage of the population. And then after each response, measure whether we've done that and figure out what went wrong, what we did right, towards driving a cycle of continuous improvement. The one thing that we continue to struggle with is, now I've dinged the UN, I'm going to ding myself, is around risk, is about identifying what risk is, measuring it, managing it, and then being okay to tolerate it in many, many places. Whether that's financial, legal, or security, which is it's mostly. Establishing a culture where it's that the message is, we will figure out a way you can respond while managing risk, rather than we will manage the risk and see if a response is possible, which is what we see around the world at the moment, and most days I see within my own organization. So those are some of my reflections. I'm looking forward to engaging in the conversation.
Great, Bob. Thank you so much. I think the way you started with a call for the need to see change in the donor invest in capacity, not just response. I mean, I think this metaphor that you have of firefighters don't get paid per fire is really illustrative, and it's also an example of how the long term and the short term can be done at the same time. And thinking needs it's about planning and preparation, and a focus on the front line and what are the needs on the front line. And thank you for the frank reflection about what is need to be done inside the house. We've got quite a bit of time for discussion. I was wondering, though, before we go to the floor, if I could put you on the spot for a second. Bob mentioned the new way of working, and I think that this concept kind of is at the heart a bit of some of the challenge that has been identified in terms of squaring the circle of thinking about short-term, long-term emergency response and helping to adapt for protracted crises. I wonder if you could explain that a little bit to us and see where you see the challenges and the opportunities.
Sure. In the first instance, I think all of us, whatever our role within an international endeavour, have to be providing value for the people who depend on us. So whenever we have these discussions about whether to do this or whether to do that or what's the priority and so forth, it should be driven by what people demand of us, who are the ones who are depending on us. They're the ones who should be telling us what the prioritization should be. We do necessarily, as an international community, have different instruments for responding to a multiplicity of needs which are interlinked and often, sometimes indivisible in some respects. But there is a humanitarian component to responding, and it has a license, a modus operandi, which is very distinct. It's regulated by need, it's driven by international norms and standards and international legal frameworks. And we saw in the most politically divisive conflict for the last number of years, the Syria crisis, we did see the Security Council unify unanimously around the humanitarian imperative. Because, there is a platform upon which we have a legal mandated basis to act. And in that case, against the objections of the government, who didn't want us crossing their borders without their permission, right? But in the context of the imperative, the humanitarian imperative, and all the frameworks that we have put in place, and our resolution that was adopted unanimously 25 years ago, the sovereign objection was overridden. So that's a very strong instrument for action. It's also an instrument that is very focused, which is on the life-saving component. It's just the case that you have to address the needs in a triage. You have to address the most urgent needs first, otherwise people die. But that's not the only need. What happens when you keep them alive? And this is what came through to us in the World Humanitarian Summit very clearly. There's no dignity in being kept alive for 17 or 18 years in a refugee camp. People want to have the prospect of a life, of being able to have the prospect for themselves, and particularly for their children, of a better condition than they're currently trapped in. So this is where then you get to the so-called nexus between keeping people alive, which is the humanitarian response, and the development. And it's not either or, it's actually both. But we have, unfortunately, and that's why in our community we have a lot of intellectuals who are a long way removed from the front line. and we spend a lot of time talking about the concepts, right? And it's quite frustrating, of course, for colleagues on the front line that so much time and effort is dedicated into these concepts, whether it's called the new way of working or whatever. When in actual fact, if you go to the front line, you actually look back at the international community, whatever that might be, but we know what it is. There's a capacity from the international community that can be mobilized to help people. First thing you have to do is save their life. Second thing you have to do is restore some dignity and hope, and then translate that into action. Okay? Now, there are many instruments in the international community for doing the different components of that, not just humanitarian, not just development, but peacekeeping, the prevention efforts on the political side, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to this this issue of the so-called nexus between humanitarian development and peace and security and so forth, I mean, we've been at this thing since the 1980s. Back in the 1980s, we called it the link between relief and development. So that was a nice title. It kind of actually described what we were trying to do, link relief and development. In the 1990s, we then got into a more intellectual component, which was a continuum of action, right? Then we had the contiguum that came in 2000. Then in 2005, in the humanitarian reform, we made early recovery a cluster of humanitarian action. We said it's actually part of humanitarian action to begin the recovery. So you do it simultaneously, right? It's not either or, it's there. But let us also be clear. It's not a matter of choosing between helping to provide a plumpy nut to a starving child or a livelihood support to their parents. I mean, you have to save the life and help to restore the livelihood. But if you have to choose between the two, then you will be saving the life of the starving child. We then went on to resilience in 2011, and then coming out of the World Humanitarian Summit, we have a new way of working. I mean, it's a label that continues to change, but it's a concept that remains very consistent. We know that we have to do more than keep people alive. And we had a big falling out with our MSF colleagues at the World Humanitarian Summit because you felt that we were giving too much emphasis to the ending need component in a humanitarian summit. But we will stand foursquare that what we hear from the people who are particularly those caught up in protracted crises, the ones that go on not for a year or two, but for a decade or two, is you've got to do more for us than keep us alive. So again, we're bringing this as humanitarians to everybody's attention because it's our duty to do that. But it's not at the expense of humanitarian action, and there is a very clear distinction of the modality of action between how you conduct development action and how you conduct humanitarian action. And that is something also that cannot be lost in the endeavour to have more coherence, to have greater synergy, more complementarity. Absolutely. But we need functioning systems in the first place. So right now, what we as humanitarians need is we need a reform of the development system. That's what the Secretary General has set out in his agenda. We need the development system fixed. And then we'd be delighted to engage with a fully functional and effective development system so that we can be optimally coherent, optimally efficient, and optimally effective. The problem is not the nexus between development and humanitarian. The problem is that the development system is not working. Now, we had the same problem in the humanitarian system some years ago. Back in 2011, we were a complete mess. We had a complete mess in Haiti. We had a complete failure in Pakistan, all well documented. And we had to get our act together. We had to fix our system. Is it perfect today? No, it's not. But it's functional. It's functional. And this is something that, again, we want to make clear that it's not about merging all these systems into one. It's about getting the systems to be absolutely top-notch in their own areas and then making sure that there is overarching coherence and linkages. And that's what Bob was talking about when he said that as humanitarians, we want to inform the World Bank of our understanding of what's driving vulnerability at the country level. Because they can then take that into account when they're devising their programs to address the longer term needs of the people, which is a livelihood and an economic regeneration and so forth. So again, I think we have to be very clear that we need our instruments to be effective, each of them. Peacekeeping does peacekeeping. Development does development. Humanitarian does humanitarian. Human rights does human rights. Absolutely. But they should also be working in synergy and in harmony. And of course, we should all be accountable to the people that depend on us, that as the different instruments, we're optimal in that efficiency and effectiveness. But again, we have a long way to go before we get there to make sure that each of the instruments in their own role are actually where they should be. And you have to be very careful on the humanitarian instrument. It has a unique modus operandi mandated by the General Assembly, which is very distinct from the mandate that is given to the international development effort or the other elements of international effort. It's very unique and therefore must be respected.
Thank you. Very, very, very helpful. And we talk in this room a lot about working across silos, and it's a really important point to make. Working across silos, integration, system coherence, aligning agendas doesn't mean just combining everything together and mixing it around. It's that the division of labor remains, and it's important. We'll go to the floor unless Teresa, do you want to respond to anything there? No. So we'll go to the floor for Q&A. The floor is now open. Questions. Tough to follow that.
Hi, I'm Alice DeBar from IPI. Thank you very much to all of the panelists. This was really interesting, and also to get sort of your concrete ideas on ways to move forward. My question is about the cluster system, which we have as a means to coordinate humanitarian action. And to any or all of you, I'm wondering what you perceive to be, when we're talking about emergency response, what's the current added value of the cluster system? Are there things that are working when we're talking about emergency response? If so, what are they? And then in a follow-up, what do we need to change or to reform in this mechanism to allow for more better, efficient emergency response?
Great, thank you. Yes, in the back, please.
Roy Licklider from Rutgers. As an outsider, I think you have to assume that you are not going to get many more new resources. You're going to have to work with the ones you've got. And that's really hard, but I think that's the reality of the situation.
So I guess I'll rephrase that in a question. How can we respond to these issues with the resource that we actually have? We assume that there are not going to be additional resources. Yes, also here in the middle.
Hi there, Kieran Dwyer with UNICEF. John. John, you talked a lot about accountability to the affected populations. One of the debates that was emerging around the World Humanitarian Summit, though, was from humanitarian actors in local communities. There is, of course, the governments, but when we're talking about conflict situations, as you said, that's often hard to maybe get them ready to have their response systems ready. But what do the panelists think, and what are you doing to build a readiness, a preparedness, and what should donors be doing to build preparedness among a humanitarian sector in countries that we know often face humanitarian emergencies and will do over time?
Great, thank you. I think we'll come back to the panel, and then we should have time for another round from the floor if there are other questions. Maybe we'll start on the end, Bob, with you, and then just come down the line.
Yeah, I'll have a go at the question about clusters. It feels like we've been talking about clusters for decades, and they continue to be necessary and inefficient all at the same time. I think the biggest issue that I see with clusters at the moment is that they are often or increasingly not present when we need them. And we find that their absence is increasingly driven by the will and politics of member states. So two examples in Nigeria, where we attempted to declare a level 3, and the government indicated that they weren't pleased with that. We indicated that we wanted to launch the cluster system, and the government indicated that they weren't happy with that either. we were able to, so clusters is the formal system, it's the line of last resort. We had coordination meetings, but we weren't able to apply our muscle memory of who's going to do what, who's going to assure standards, who's going to take the lead. The same thing's playing out now in Bangladesh, because the government has expressed a strong preference around one certain coordination structure that doesn't give room for clusters or refugee working groups. And as a result, the actors involved are doing their very best, but the response is somewhat off kilter. We're struggling to follow the normal procedures because it all looks different and has different terms. So I think where they're present, they're operating. I'm concerned that there's increasingly places where they're not present.
One of the we are not part of the cluster system, so it's difficult to talk something that you are not part of. But one of the problems that we see more and more is that there is a tendency to have a coverage, like everything is covered, even the activities are very low sometimes, so it's difficult. There is a competition of a space, but also the presence of, not necessarily with a lot of supervision of what is done, no? And with not so many people reaching, and if we are talking about emergency and insecure places, not many people reaching, so you have a map of coverage of the needs of the population, and there is no so often that there is a discussion on how they are addressed. You put a stick of whatever organization, but there is no so much discussion on the real needs coverage, on the quality of what we are doing, and how we can improve. And it's true that we are not in all the discussions, but we quite often go to as visitors, and I think it is very important to avoid this vision of we need to cover a map. We need to cover the needs of the population, not the map.
How about the question on resources? I know in the report there's some suggestion that there's been too much focus on the question of the resource gap. That yes, there's been actually more in my understanding, anyways, that there has been more humanitarian aid, but also the need is greater, and maybe focusing on that too much has sort of taken us away from some of concentrating on the immediate priorities. What can we do to help solve the emergency gap if the resources aren't coming in the way they need to be?
There are some crises where we don't see. There are others that we see a clear gap on resources, and others that we don't see that much the gap, but we see a total unbalanced decision on where to put the money. And let's be clear, I'm not going to put an example because I don't want to upset anybody, but I was discussing the other day with one of our head of missions, and in the country that this person is, the big majority of the money goes to the areas that they are safe for everybody to go, that they are not exactly the same areas, that they are in the most important needs for the population. So I think there is a need of more money. If the money doesn't come, what we have to be is extremely careful on making the right choices. Anyway, if we go to the very low level of NGOs, there are a lot of ways to reduce the cost and to be a little bit more prepared and to engage. But it's clear that in the context that we are now, with high level of conflict, with a lot of aerial operations, with a lot of security constraints, and we will need the money. The community will need the money. So I think there will be still a plea for the money, and at the same time we have really to make sure that if there is not enough money, the money goes to the right place. Prioritization, and then whatever is not possible, it will be the less priority for the population.
Okay, well, I'm most definitely not accepting that we're not going to get more money, just to be crystal clear. There's 585,000 children under the age of 5 died last year in the Sahel for no other reason than a lack of food and medical care. And it didn't make a global headline. We're losing our humanity. We're losing our humanity. But the bad news for the people who are losing their humanity in the rich world is that you're going to pay a very high price for this. Because when you have the proliferation of despair and a sense of injustice and hopelessness, and then you go into the whole issues of criminality and corruption and so on and so forth. Then we move into what's called terrorism and so on and so forth. There is a well and a source. Now, that doesn't mean that poverty and impoverishment is a justification for insecurity and violence. But I can tell you there's a direct linkage, right? And they're winning. The people in the world who are promoting an agenda of insecurity are winning. There's more of them. They're conducting more conflicts. More people are being killed, and it's not geographically confined. So we need to wake up to this reality. Losing our humanity is going to affect everybody everywhere. And if we say we can't afford our humanity, then shame on us. Another example is Ebola from a couple of years ago. How did Ebola take hold in West Africa? No health system, no functioning health system. But the lack of a functioning health system in those countries in West Africa almost cost us the global economy. Almost. And anyone who wants to criticize the cluster system, fine. But the cluster system came to bear also out of that in terms of what is the cluster system? It's just a way of working together. Can it be improved? Absolutely. And we have got to keep evolving to the operational demands on us to work together. But we're a very broad community, and we have a struggle always to find a mechanism which is efficient and effective for working together as such a broad community. And of course, we have to keep working on that. But back to the funding issue, I am not accepting also that there isn't an adequate amount of funding. Why? Because there's plenty of money being spent on international action that is not having the effect and the positive effect that if that money was spent on humanitarian or development action. And this isn't my own view. This is the view of the heads of all of our member states who trooped here to New York City, got up onto the podium in the General Assembly and professed commitment to the SDGs. And they put a timeline on it. So where are we now in Burundi, Niger, Chad, Central African Republic? Is nobody being left behind? Because they also said that they would start with the countries that were furthest behind first. Now we're 3 years into it. And this is the problem. The problem is that there's a huge disconnect. So my challenge is, let's take the military spend globally. Trillions, 17.3. That's what's available on the public websites. That doesn't account for all the other stuff that goes on, right? Declared. Is it going to be such an alarming negative consequence for the planet if less than 1% was shifted from that expenditure over to the development and humanitarian side? And I challenge those who have the authority to do it, because in actual fact, as we all know, budgets never are spent out to 100%. So if you look at the historical expenditure rates of the military budgets globally, just look at then make a calculation that, well, actually, we have budgeted for this, but we know we won't spend it, so let's upfront say, right, let's fund the humanitarian appeal globally. It's only another 10 billion, right? And let's have a look at the effect that that will have on the state of affairs in the world in terms of saving lives, those hundreds of thousands of kids just in the Sahel, but then there are hundreds of thousands elsewhere as well. They will be saved, and so on. And do the calculation of what is the consequence. And if, of course, you can prove that more people will die and suffer needlessly if we cut the military expenditure by less than 1% to fund all of the humanitarian needs globally, then fine, fair enough. Then we can move on and we can have a look at the other things that money is being spent on. Not against the military, they have a very important role to play, but the fact of the matter is that these calculations are not being done. We are not making the calculation on the basis of impact. And isn't it interesting that that most of the best equipped, best trained militaries are doing exercises instead of being part of international peacekeeping. I mean, what are we looking for here? As I said, we have to step up now and really address these issues and not accept that we don't have the money to save these kids, because we do have the money to save these kids. But we're not having the right discussion about it. We're not having the, and colleagues like my colleagues in MSF, they're the ones who are there on the front line while the children are dying in front of them, just because we haven't got the paltry amount of food assistance, the basic medical assistance. We are talking about this humanitarian appeal is only for the basics, just to keep people alive. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I mean, it's not too often we get a direct challenge to world leaders from the stage, but I'm glad we did here today, and I'm sure that'll be tweeted out on social media in multiple forms. But I think the key thing about the question of resources is that it's not about the lack of resources. There are resources in the world. It's about distribution. It's about priorities. And the political will to distribute them where we really do need them. We're losing our humanity, as you say, and that moral call should be enough. But if it's not, there's also self-interest here. Some people are calling the new World Bank study on prevention the business case for prevention. That prevention is actually going to save us all a lot, both in our humanity and the resources. We have opportunity for another round of questions, if any. Yes, sir, here in the.
I'm Adam. I'm a consultant. It seems like the core issues that have been identified today are primarily political. The gentleman from IRC identified some recalcitrance in host countries around identifying crises or publicizing them, allowing the cluster group to form. Everybody has identified a resource gap, a funding gap. Is there room for the NGOs and maybe the UN as an institution to be more politically engaged with donor countries about the burden and with host countries about their responsibility to allow access? Is that an area where we can be pushing harder to be more politically active and advocate for these resources and advocate for access? Or is there a genuine, well-founded fear that will actually close more doors and create more barriers to access?
Thank you. Good question. Any other questions before we close the list? No. Okay. Sorry. Oh, one back there. Oh, great. Oh.
Hi, I'm Katie. I'm an aspiring humanitarian. And I think all of you spoke at some point or other about accountability to beneficiaries and how important that is. And I think as we move into this new way of working, humanitarian development nexus, it becomes more complicated to achieve accountability when it's not just about saving lives, but about sort of more intangible, less concrete outcomes. And I wondered if any of you could speak to best practices or things your organizations are doing to make sure that you're accountable to the populations you're serving.
Anyone else? No. Okay, so we'll come back to the table for final remarks. I think we'll go Bob, John, and then Teresa. I'll give you the last word. Okay, Bob.
I'm not sure. So your question about should we push, advocate, pressure donors and member states, host governments. I think the easy answer is there's always more we can do with donors. There's more organisation and collective action that we can push. I don't think I'd be sad if you came away from this conversation thinking that we hadn't done anything. I think I've been involved in multiple conversations talking to donors around investing up front and having response funds, and it's just not gone anywhere. It's a complex nut to crack. And I think their inability to crack it is a symptom of the global retreat from engaging in problems overseas that increasingly the world is looking inwards and trying to serve its own constituents rather than extending an arm of humanity, as John said, around the world. So I think they could if they wanted to. So the second one around host states, yeah, I think we should. I think collectively as NGOs, we are worried about being kicked out. And I think that often, I can speak to my own organization, we are gun shy, gun's not the right word, we are shy in speaking up and risking being kicked out, and find ourselves stuck in the limbo of not being able to work because we're not registered or we don't have the right permissions. So we're not moving forwards, we're not moving backwards, we're just stuck. I think a few brave organizations, UN organizations as well, have missed opportunities to speak up and tell the truth and be kicked out and shine a light on being kicked out. And I think that should be part of our toolbox. I think there are opportunities in Syria where we should have stood up and said, this is not okay, kick us out, go on. And then shone a light on that. And that isn't a tool that we use often, and we should use it more.
Well, I think again, agreeing with Bob in terms of political engagement. That's why I started this afternoon by saying that, we have got to address the issue to those who have the capacity to change the situation. And the world is run by the rich countries. They've got the money, they've got the military power, and they use it mostly for their own economic benefit. The benefit of their citizens. But it has to be an understanding that it's not a zero sum. We're forgetting the lessons of history. And the zero sum that gave us the Versailles Treaty after the First World War created the conditions for the Second World War. But at the end of the Second World War, there was a completely different mindset and mentality, which gave birth to the institution across the street, the Charter, the Human Rights Charter. Gave us the Marshall Plan for Europe, all about recovery. It doesn't mean, of course, that everything is about economic development. It's not. But it's at the core of the solution. And we are falling so way short. I mean, what percentage of US GDP was given to Europe at the end of the Second World War? I think it was 4.2%. 4.2%. We're looking for 0.07%, right? And we're not looking for it. That's the whole point. We're not looking for it. The heads of state and heads of government came to this city in 2015 and they signed up. It's their initiative. Our job is to call them out. So yes, we have to engage, and we have to move it beyond, that it's about money. It is profoundly about our choice of what world do we want and what are we prepared to do to contribute to the world which is a civilized world, a world of security, peace, stability, economic development, well-being, hope, and so forth. And as I said, we don't need to reinvent any of this. It's all there. We don't need to convince the political leadership of what should be done. They've already committed to do it. But where's the accountability to do it? And there is no shortage, let me tell you, of humanity in the poorest parts of the world. So if you go to Diffa in Niger, the poorest country in the world, bottom of the Human Development Index, and the poorest place in the poorest country, you will find the community there with their arms open for the refugees who have fled from the richest country in Africa, which is their neighbour. And they are sharing what little they have. And they're not building walls or fences or whatever. There's where the humanity still resides. It does reside in those places. And they should be inspiring us to do much, much more on our side, because we've much more capacity than they have. And as far as accountability goes, I'm very pleased to tell you that it's not so technically difficult at all when you go to these places, because it's actually the basics. And this is my problem as well. We are becoming too bureaucratic on very simple issues. We want matrices, we want all sorts of reports. When you go to Central African Republic, when we talk about the nexus between humanitarian and development, in a country that has no functioning education system at all. We're talking about 20 years before MSF can get out of there because there's no schools to educate the kids to be nurses or doctors, right? This isn't so about, again, these processes. This is about the very basics, that we have a huge amount of work to do in all of these countries where they are so profoundly underdeveloped. They are very modest in their demand of us. They're in many places, they know themselves that they are going to continue to live in subsistence, but they want a better future for their kids. So in actual fact, to do things differently in these countries means to get in there with the development programs that build an infrastructure of education, of healthcare, just the basics, then begin a physical infrastructure that enables trade and economy and so on and so forth, whether it's roads, whether it's electricity. It's all the basic stuff. We do not need to over-intellectualize any of this. And there's where you're going to make the biggest difference, is a few simple steps in the poorest countries. And this will give people hope, but it will also give them something in competition for those who would try to hijack them to other ulterior roles in life. Because that is also part of the reality, as I said, when you look in these places where these other organizations are operating much more effectively, I might say. Thank you.
It's difficult to after here. But there was a question that we didn't answer. It's about how we prepare ourselves to, I don't remember who asked it, but what are the things for preparing ourselves to respond to emergencies? I mean, in countries where we are not. We are, for example, trying to do what we call bureaucratic emergency preparedness. So it's a dialogue with the states where we are not present, in places where today they are not emergencies, so therefore we are not there. But if they are, we want to be there. I think also we have to be more clever in the way we approach governments, in the way we decide frames with them, in the way we pre-discuss things that doesn't look like coming out of the moon in the moment that you have a discussion. We were discussing yesterday about vaccination in outbreaks, and not starting to discuss from scratch if you overcome or not the under one and the routine vaccination. So I think yes, there is a lot of work to be done. If I go to the preparedness of organizations, and about the dialogue with all actors in the world we want to discuss. And I think a reminder of the commitments that the people has done and the lack of effective result of these commitments. It has to be said day by day, at least that they have to have an answer of why this is not happening. And the discussions with donors, even if we have fatigue, I think at least for this week that we have had an endless number of discussions, there is, I think, still there is a space to continue to create the possibility. And if we don't push, it will be even more easier for them not to react. So I think for me, the humanitarian work is a very, I mean, if you ask me, very repetitive work, because we have the same problems since ever. We never managed to solve them, but we have to fight to solve them. And the day that you lose the hope is the day that you lose your capacity to be an humanitarian, for me. I mean, I consider that discussing with the more difficult actor is my obligation, and even if I know it's a no, still I think it's my obligation. And the final word for me is that humanitarianism needs to exist. We are humans. We have to have a focus on the population in the more acute phase of their suffering. And we have to, between all of us, to be sure that this space is not shrink more and more. We have to fight for the security constraints. We have to fight for the funding constraints. And we have also to prepare ourselves and to really think that it is possible. And as you were saying, for security, no, it's not when the risk zero will exist that we will be able to go. We are going to go, and then how we are going to make it possible. But our goal has to be, yes, we are going to respond, yes, we are going to be there, and then we have to work from now until I don't know when to get the best response possible. But the question is not if we can go, is we have to go. We have to have an humanitarian space, and we have to have the agility to respond to the needs of the population.
Great. Thank you so much. I mean, it's really been an inspiring conversation. Though this discussion was originally framed as sort of an operational discussion about how to close the gap, but I think it's clear these are political issues. It's about priorities, about holding states accountable to their commitments, but most importantly, it's about this filling this humanitarian need, a focus on the people on the front line and their perspectives. But I take very strongly your final comment there about hope, because actually I do take hope from this conversation, that there are resources available. We need to distribute them well. We need to have the political will to marshal them. We've heard the calls here, but also it seems to me that there's a real broad consensus about the issue. We often debate about what is the issue, but there seems to be a really broad consensus about what is the problem, what is the issue, and that's usually a very good way to start to solve the problem. So I really appreciate it here. Thank you all for coming, and please come again.